So I'd like to ask your full attention for Maryanne, but I don't think that will be very hard.
So hello to all of you, and I can't thank you enough for waiting till this moment. And I feel like the Boston Red Sox closer, where I'm trying to pull together all that you've done, but also give a story, if you will, to both the science and the poetry that's involved in reading. So I'm not going to take the full hour that Inga, and she was so wonderful in organizing it, but I'm going to at least give you a kind of 101 of the reading brain. And I have to say, it is such a pleasure to be with all of you. In particular, I have quoted so many of you. You don't even know how many of you that I have quoted, but I have never quoted Kiana before, and it's such a pleasure to follow her. And Kiana, I want to actually begin not like what I thought I would begin, but with a haiku. And it actually embodies both my talk and I hope so many of yours. And was this: you ask of me truth, lilac blossoms in the wind blow now in my mind. And I'm hoping that that experiential aspect of this tiny haiku will actually be a bridge, Kiana, between your work and mine. And I'm going to, I hope, give each of you, I wish I could quote from each of you, but I will at least be a bookend with Susanna, this talk this morning, and Catherine in the middle. I would quote all of you. I was just delighted. I was here every minute of the day. But Susanna talked about how we are in this moment of both and. And indeed, my talk about literacy and the reading brain and how digital reading is quite different in what it demands of the brain from book reading, I hope to give you a both and presentation that will also, Kiana, embody what you and Catherine, and I have quoted Catherine so often on this, the importance of this immersive experiential quality, a quality of attention, a quality of reading that goes beyond what we often think of as a visual cognitive linguistic experience, but it's much more than that. Well, I come to you from California. I only wish I could have been with you in Santa Barbara, but it was because I'm giving these 20 talks. But it's not just this week, it's over 3 weeks, so please, Inga, it's not as bad as it said. But what I want to say to you is that reading, and it has so many different aspects, but I've always thought of it in the Vonnegutian sense. When Kurt Vonnegut said, you know, what does the artist do? The artist is the canary in the mine. Well, for me, how we read is a canary in the mind. And how we read is changing, and I think in both very powerful, good ways and very perilously menacing, ominous, pernicious ways. And so I want to preface this in a way by saying we have been in this hinge moment, but after COVID, we're not in a hinge moment. We are firmly within a digital culture that influences not only what we read and how things are changing, and there's so many things that are changing, but how important it is that we recognize that how we read is changing in ways that influence how we think. And I will quote another poet. This is great to follow my Dutch colleague, but it's T.S. Eliot. And he asked the question in a way that is at the heart of my work. Where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost in information? Now, I could quote everybody today, I have quoted actually at least, well, there's Anne Mangan and all the people who are part of the e-read network in talking about this paradox that we are all bombarded by information overload. And the paradox is that instead of being able, like our transformer neural networks, GPT-3, we can't deal with all that information. In overloading, we are ending up, as so many of you have written, with cognitive, literally cognitive consequences, but also democratic consequences. Because as some of you have written, and I have been really worried about, and I want to say I wrote a Guardian article too on this and got much more information to people than I did in any book. So I just couldn't help but tell our former speaker about that too. But the whole concept here is that we're overloaded. And when we're overloaded, there are consequences in which we are not getting the same level of knowledge because it changes not only how we read, but what we read. Now, my perspective is as a translator, if you will, of neuroscience into how it can be used by all of us, but especially by the younger generation. So you're going to hear an emphasis that was not as present, except in Catherine's talk, about how children learn and what that means for our next generation, but also what it means for us as adults. And as I asked this morning, I think I wanted, it was a preface to my own thinking. I asked a question about how all of these changes in technologies really are affecting our own consciousness. And I used Walter Ong's work in which he said technologies are not mere exterior aids, but also interior transformations of consciousness, and never more than when they affect the word. And this is something that has really deep implications for us when we think about how we read differently on a screen and in print. And I look back to Nicholas of Cusa, a philosopher, who posed it in this way. How do we resolve a coincidence of opposite, believable truths? And Susanna, as I said, it was a bookend for this. And she was giving this both and perspective. Well, Nicholas of Cusa did that too, but from a standpoint of what he called learned ignorance, in which we take a stance, in which we look, he wouldn't have said 40,000 feet up, we can, and we look at the knowledge available on these two truths. And so today, in just a short amount of time, I want to introduce you, I want to almost take you on a tour of the reading brain circuit. Now, Inga mentioned my book, Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, but it begins with a fundamentally simple insight. No brain was born to read. None of us have a single gene or a single region. Rather, what the brain does is use its design principles to connect regions of the brain that are very important to connect visual areas with multiple language areas, multiple cognitive areas, and here's where attention comes in. Multiple attentional regions are necessary for this circuit to work. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, but it's not just cognition, language, and vision. It is also affect. It is also motor. And as I said in the interim with Kiana, when we read deeply, when we read immersively, to give an example, which I always do in my own head, we literally employ our motor regions as well when we are so immersed. And I use the simple, beautiful scene from Anna Karenina that somehow is just this image in my mind in which she has this red bag at the railroad station. And at first she can't leap, and then she does. But when she leaps on the tracks, if that's the first time you are reading it, your motor regions are activated too in the areas for leaping, for running, for motion. In other words, that circuit is embodied, an embodied circuit, just as several of you, especially Catherine, some of her previous books have really honed in on this. We have a circuit that is so extraordinarily beautifully complex, but it begins very simply and it remains plastic. Now, that's going to be one of the essential components for you to remember. But before I leave this slide, because Inga has so rightly asked all of us to talk about attention, I will at least mention that on this slide, you will understand one of the responses I would have given to Inga's question about the differences in attention between a human and a machine. The human has multiple layers of the brain involved in attention from the start. It involves disinhibiting, it involves focusing, it involves coordinating. Before we ever move our eye to the thing itself, we have already activated 3 attentional mechanisms, what's called the orienting network. Only then does the attentional system that most of you know about in the executive function areas in the prefrontal cortex begin to work. But when it works, it takes time. It takes 2 varieties of time. It takes time in terms of short-term memory, keeping things going and coordinated, but then it takes time to the question, how much of that circuit is actually going to be involved in processing? We need you to understand that before we move quickly on, because attention is not just momentary. Attention has multiple aspects. The poet William Stafford said this, there is a quality of attention given us. That quality has a layered complexity in the brain that, according to the time we give to the rest of the circuit, we will either read, Akiana, you said not reading. Well, for me, it's the equivalent of not reading. We're reading on the surface, whether we call that the shallowing hypothesis, like Anne and others. And if you remember, Nicholas Carr talked about the shallows. He rightly and generously was really talking about that as in opposition to what I'm going to be talking to you in the terms of deep reading. Well, attention has to be given to that elaborate set of deep reading processes for true reading, true embodied experiential immersive reading, the kind that can lead to the meditative and the contemplative. So attention plays an extraordinary role, but not just one role, but many. And now the second very important premise for what I'm saying is this plasticity. This is a tough one. It's an easy one in the sense that you can easily look and see that all of us who speak different languages actually are using the circuit in different ways. For my Chinese colleagues, or those who are reading Japanese kanji, we're using many more areas, if you will, of the visual areas in both hemispheres, much more than in an alphabetic system. Even an alphabetic system, the Dutch system is much more irregular than the English. French and English are much more alike than German, Italian, Dutch, etc., which are regular. Depending on the writing system, the circuit is subtly or even blatantly different. We share a lot. Every circuit shares a lot, but there are differences. Why do I even bother to say that to you? because it, by analogy, prepares you for the reality that the medium has different emphases too. The affordances of the medium, like the different characteristics of writing systems, that will be reflected in how the brain circuit works. The purpose as well of why you're reading what you're reading. That will influence the different, if you will, emphases of that brain. Now, if I would just give you a very quick overview of what happens with that first brain, it depends so much. And here, half of my talks are really about what happens when this tiny little depiction of the reading brain doesn't happen. But it happens in large part because each of those regions is being developed in our childhood and in our background. But each is also going to be determined. And here's where inequity is always a factor. It's going to be determined by what happens in 0 to 5 and then during the schooling process. We can either have this very simple reading circuit, or over time with our education, with our formation, we can become an ever more elaborated one in which the deep reading, sophisticated processes that I.A. Richards and others call close reading occur. Now, I need to only give you a, if you will, a snapshot of this, but I wish to do so because I want you who are, especially who are doing so much beautiful work in literary criticism, and I want you to understand that for me, close reading is an extremely beautiful set of processes, only some of which I'm going to talk to you now. Now, the great he's just one of, to me, he wrote the single best first book on a history of reading, Alberto Manguel. And he is a representative for me of the analogical processes we use when we read. That is, we bring, and that's why when I talk about childhood, what happens even before 5 is so important. But what we bring, whether we're 5 or 50 or 95, what we bring to the text is used analogically to make inferences, to as Alberto say, to proceed from what we know to what is new. Reading, as he said, is cumulative and proceeds with geometric progression. Each new reading builds upon what the reader has read before. This is something we need our students to know. Now, the other aspect that is so often neglected when we talk about reading is that it is our best laboratory for what either Nussbaum calls the compassion imagination, or Hockenmulder calls our moral laboratory. Anne works with Hockenmulder, and I think Inga, you must too. But empathy is not just about feeling. It is, as another wonderful medieval scholar who probably few of you have ever spent a lot of time with, but she said this in an amazing way, that compassion increases our senses. It gives life. What she said was, be a hunter-gatherer for goodness. Well, empathy is learned from Frog and Told, from Charlotte's Web, from Middlemarch. It is learned from Gish Jen's new novel, Mr. Nixon Goes to China, as well as her book on the resistors. It is Marilyn Robinson's Gilead trilogy. We have a compassionate imagination that happens because, in part, of what fiction does for us. And when Kiana talked about the Chinese poetry and Zen Buddhism, which I also study in a very small way compared to her, but this freedom from the ego has to have roots in childhood. We have to learn to lose or leave behind, as the sole arbiter of our behavior, the egocentrism that people like Piaget told us so much about. And what helps us do that is fiction, our short stories, our myths, our fairy tales. Oatley, who does some wonderful work, said, what's a piece of fiction? What's a novel? What's a short story? It's a piece of consciousness being passed from mind to mind. My theologian teacher, John Donne, talked about this in terms of passing over, passing beyond our ego into the other. But all of that leads us, all of this analogical thinking, our ability to infer, to reason, to deduce, to induce, all of it comes together. And here's where attention is absolutely at the forefront. We can attend to this, or we can simply browse and skim. But when we attend to really pulling all of this together, what we have is the basis, the platform for critical analysis, in which we have the capacity to bring to bear what our frontal cortices do so well. They build hypotheses. Here's a hypothesis. It's wrong. I refute it. Or it's right. It's my imprimatur. But there's like this cortical dance that goes on that helps us discern the truth from false information. But for doing this, attention must be given to it, and that needs time. And that's going to be a leitmotif as I link it to digital reading in just a few minutes. But the point of this kind of reading is discernment of beauty. It's perceptual. It's sensorial. Marilyn Robinson always talked about that when words evoke our senses, they propel not just our emotions, but our thought itself. So critical analysis is this extraordinarily important aspect of what we are aiming for, whatever the medium is. And I use Thomas Aquinas here for a lot of reasons. Someone might, we probably don't have time to ask me why, but I use it as a way of actually talking about that quote from Ken about reading as being a meditative act. He said, we must hand on to others the things gained in contemplation. Well, the reason why I named my first book Proust and the Squid is too complicated to tell now, except for one thing. And that is that Proust said that at the heart of reading is when we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own best thoughts, our own ability to think. And that requires what Inga quoted from me, a term I use, cognitive patience, in which we have both time in milliseconds that we either give or do not give to those deep reading processes that lead to wisdom in those rare moments when we get there through a contemplation of the author's meanings, or we don't. But it also takes years in its development, and here is the statement that will lead us to the next. It's never a given. It has never been less a given than in the last years in which digital reading has replaced in large part with multiple consequences, good and ill, for what happens in our society's absorption of information. Now, what my colleague at UCLA, Patricia Greenfield, said long ago, and I have written extensively about this in my new book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in the Digital World. Every medium has its cost and weaknesses, but the cost in the digital medium seems to be deep processing. And there's a reason. The implications of plasticity, go back to what I said. The implications of plasticity are that we will use certain areas of our brain dependent on the medium's affordances. And there's no question that the digital medium gives us massive information, which we need so desperately to to progress as a species. But at the same time, it advantages fast processing and does not advantage, as does the print medium, the use of attention to consolidate knowledge and give time for reflection and insight. So both the medium and the purpose, I never deep read on the email, excuse me, everybody who's ever written me on email. That is hardly the purpose, but the purpose will dictate the use of the circuit. Now, before you accuse me of being a Luddite, I have to quote Sherry Turkle, a friend and colleague. I believe this single quote from her has been so helpful to me. We transgress not because we try to build the innovative and the new, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. And therein lies the tale of our changes from where we were, I think, therefore I am, to I search, therefore I am. We are vessels of information retrieval, but what we do with that information, whether we translate it into knowledge, whether we translate knowledge into wisdom, is something we must understand. And that's, I go back to Nicholas Accuse of learned ignorance. We have to build evidence. And Meng and Inga, the entire eRead network, Delgado, Marie Barzilai, Tommy Katsir, there's so many, Rakit Ackerman, Hockenmulder, there's so many people doing this work on developmental evidence on what is happening to the quality of attention. Now, I won't go through all of this research, but I will simply say we have neuroimaging that shows that there are differences in the white matter integrity according to how often the adolescents or youth are reading on the screen versus reading books in print. And we have evidence from our pediatric neurologist that when you compare the same story being read to by an adult, a caretaker, or just a loved one, versus hearing it, versus seeing all the bells and whistles displayed on a screen, when we look at how the brain is activated in its language regions, now these are little children, we see that it is when the child is being read to, where affection, now think embodiment again, where affection, where the elaboration of a relationship with an adult goes on, activates language regions far more than the other two. Audio is actually superior to the digital version. And if you just think about the passivity in which all this occurs when you hear the same story versus when you see it all ready for you with no need for your imagination to be involved, no elaboration, you can understand why people like me are worried about the overemphasis of the digital medium for our young. And this goes all the way throughout adolescence, where we are worried, like those of you who have read Dopamine Nation know we are very worried about our kids being, if you will, addicted to dopamine lollipops, that they are needing higher and higher levels of stimulation, after which, was it Susanna or Catherine who was talking about after addiction is boredom? Well, after boredom is restlessness, anxiety, depression, etc., in the work that Linda is doing in Dopamine Nation and others. We really are seeing differences in our children that are based on overstimulation and addiction. And so we have to really think about the positive, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the positive, but I need to talk about the deleterious effects of what all of us, not just our children, are becoming, which, as in San Jose, Professor Liu calls skimming is the new normal. Now, this is for all of us. that I am included. Letter 4 in my last book, Reader Come Home, is all about a self-examination in which I'm like everybody else. When my day is dominated, as it usually is, by the screen, I'm tending to use an F or a Z pattern. Zip, zip, zip. I word spot, I browse. But what are the effects of that? That is a constant ignoring of what people like Italo Calvino calls, what is the art, what is the task of the writer, but to give the most use, the absolute words for the thoughts that they have. We're missing that. We are, and David Brooks actually wrote an essay on this, we are missing beauty, but we are also missing content. We are also missing sequence. Now, our young, there's no question that we have real issues here on how often the attention network is being moving from distraction to distraction. But I did want to say something this morning to Inga and her colleague, Dr. Chateau, or almost Dr. Chateau, about distraction as part of history. Well, please, it's part of evolution. Attention is part of what is called the novelty reflex. So distracted attention was a survival mechanism. We call it novelty reflex, but it helped us see a track and know it's a predator, or see berries and know that that's something good or bad. So the distraction that we have now is in large part, if you will, the legacy of what we are programmed as a species to have, the novelty reflex. But when you do that, when your inhibitory system, your frontal lobe, hasn't developed, you've got children who are so much more susceptible. And so the changes in attention in our children, especially our young, have consequences. Now, I look at all these people on the screen and I would wish to talk about each one of them, but I'm only going to be able to talk about one big study because I do want to be able to have you have some questions. But Delgado, Vargas Ackerman, and Salmeron from Barcelona, part of the eRead network, and Anne is part of that too, and Hakamoto. There's so many great people in it. But they did this huge meta-analysis. If you remember nothing else from my talk, remember this tiny, wonderful meta-analysis of, not tiny, good Lord, 171,000 subjects were part of it, in which they simply looked at what happens when we ask comprehension questions after the same story is read in one of two mediums, digital versus print. And what you see is that comprehension, especially sequencing of details for the plot, are better in the print medium. Now, every single one of you should ask the question, but this is from 2000 to 2017. What about the digital natives at the end? That was a subset. And what you see is the effect is even more profound. Why? Rockefeller Ackerman did a perception study. Why do they think they're doing better in digital when they're actually doing better in print? You can predict what they said. Well, I'm faster on the screen. They sure are. But what that brain is doing is not activating the full panoply of deep reading processes when you are browsing and skimming and word spotting your way to the end of the page. There are many studies that I could quote, but I'm not going to quote a study now. I'm going to quote this beautiful passage years before we ever really understood the problem. Italo Calvino did. He said, "It seems to me that a pestilence has struck the human race in its most distinctive quality, our use of words. It is a plague afflicting language, revealing itself as a loss of cognition, leveling out all expression, the most generic." Anyway, you get his point. We are leveling out, and it's not just cognition that's lost. Beauty is being lost. Complexity is being lost. Empathy, our ability to leave that ego Instead, we're going to silos of information because of this overload in part, but also because of some of the reasons that many of the speakers today have talked about. We go to the familiar for confirmatory bias, something that many of you have actually written about. Silo reading is only going to increase with more and more information and more algorithms that are set up to do so. But when we do, we lose. And I know that we talked about loss, and we talked about it in a way that is different from what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the loss of the grasp of complexity that can happen with Twitter. We have evidence in a case study in a former president about how the misuse of Twitter, and it can be used in so many good ways, but the misuse or the use of Twitter to give policy that is complicated, this is a set of issues that we have to understand. Begins with, just as this conference does, with attention, but ends with how quickly attention can be, in fact, not activating all of the critical, analytic, empathic processes we possess, much less the contemplative and meditative. In other words, if we start atrophying those deep reading processes because of how we read, we are going to be giving less attention to other perspectives, and we become ever more susceptible to false information. Ever. Just as we see in Europe and Russia and Ukraine today, ever more susceptible to demagoguery in all its forms. This is a threat to our democratic society. But I want to turn to the positive. I want to turn to, what do we do about this? What are some of the wonderful things we can do to harness technology, to have it address its own weaknesses, but also to develop a deep reading biliterate brain? And here is where I want to have you just think for a few moments developmentally, how in the very beginning 10 years, 10, 12 years, we should be, in a way, in a Vygotsky-like fashion, developing those reading skills more with print and using digital technologies, which are absolutely necessary for the child, but with coding, with supplementing information for children who have struggles with practice, but teaching, in essence, helping the child learn more slowly than you would think, not speeding. We have to have fluency, but we have to have fluency for thinking, and helping children understand that reading is about thinking and feeling about themselves and about others and about new information. And so I'm trying to develop a proposal in which we have parallel tracks of development that are occurring, so that what we're doing is preserving the best processes of print reading and expanding them with digital reading. And there are people who are doing such a beautiful job of helping us, especially with younger children. I'm only going to focus or give two tiny examples. I say tiny twice incorrectly. Two wonderful examples. The first is what's called Bring Me a Book. The CEO, Judy Koch, has done this as a lifetime of gifts that she gives to children in impoverished, especially disenfranchised areas, but now all over the country. This concept, just like Reach Out and Read, is very simple. You give books to the kids. The Rotary helps. They have a little, like a little bookcase that they have, a little cubby of their own, and they are given books that they can possess, that they can choose themselves, that they can develop that habit, that, if you will, the reading sanctuary. And the cubby seems to me like a concrete example of a reading sanctuary that we want to build internally. It's like an external sanctuary for the internal one that we want to have. And it helps the family. And some families are non-literate. So we build also a reason for helping our non-literate our non-literate families uh, give their own picture books and their own way of, in whatever language it is, to build language. And part of Bring Me a Book is connected to something that is just this beautiful app called Bookalicious, in which a child's level, development, characteristics, and interest are all brought together with an avatar who then makes some suggestions. Now think, this is really agency by the child. They choose their own books, and those books, whatever they choose, are linked to either the school library or the public library immediately, or to a publisher that if they wanted to buy. But inequity is solved by this because it's connected to libraries. And I told this to the Institute for Museum and Library Science or Services this week. We need to have our libraries involved in this and not spend all their money on digital books, but on books themselves, and on ways of getting this reading sanctuary to be part of the life of a child. Now, I've quoted Martha Nussbaum twice, but she said something a long time ago that I have never, ever let go of. It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, to respect the humanity and diversity of others. Some of you may remember the beautiful exchange between Barack Obama and Marilynne Robinson. And Barack Obama at that point, he initiated the interview. He went to her and he said, "You are like a moral ambassador. I learned more about morality through novels and through knowing that things aren't black and white, but gray and everything in between." That's what the novel, the book, meant for me. To which she said, "The trend towards seeing others, which doesn't happen if you don't read, is the greatest threat to a democracy today." Again, we have a case study of a non-reader who was a president, who, for all purposes, didn't understand others in the way I hope every child will. And Nussbaum ended this by saying, "It is therefore urgent now to be producing citizens who can see the different and foreign not as something to be resisted, but as an invitation to expand their own minds and capacity for citizenship." Has there ever been a moment in which we must, as a society and as a nation, understand that what we read and how we read are equally important for citizenship? For critical analysis and empathy must be at the heart of a democracy. Now, Joseph Epstein famously said, "We are what we read," and I couldn't agree with him more. But I added this in a recent talk. The history of our digital culture ought to deal at length, not only with what we read, but how our students read broadly and deeply, for we are not only what we read, but how we read, and for what purpose on any medium. The digital literacy work by people like Sam Weinberg, the emphasis on digital wisdom by people like Julie Poirot, we need to work together to understand that why we read is also as important as what and how we read. And so I'm ending. I don't usually ever quote myself, but I decided today's the day. And I'm doing this because I think we all need to examine ourselves. Why we read is very important. And this is what I said. I read both to find fresh reason to love this world and also to leave this world behind, to enter a space where I can glimpse what lies beyond my imagination, outside my knowledge and my experience of life, to expand an ever truer, more beautiful understanding of a universe with God's footprints everywhere, and to lead a life based on this vision for my students and those who will follow. So I thank you each for all of the work today. I thank the organizers, but mostly I thank you each for taking seriously what Marilyn Robbins said about our charge today. Never before have we had, in the interest of decency and wisdom, the need to think and teach more broadly, more seriously, more deeply than ever before. Thank you so much. Hope I kept you awake.
Thank you so much, Maryanne. I cannot think of more inspiring words to end the day. That was like the perfect closing keynote.
I'm going to start with a question. I'm Alan Liu. I'm going to start in the persona of the son of an engineer.
Yes.
I was a structural engineer. So speaking of technical difficulties, the one phrase in the quotation from Martha Nussbaum that you read that stuck in my craw a little bit was the easy dismissal of technical competence.
Yeah.
So as the son of an engineer, I know that there can be shallow technical competence and deep technical competence. Technical competence and engineering knowledge that has the capability to be critical and to be socially responsible in ways that shallow technical competence is not. So my question is, whether in a modernizing technical age and increasingly digital age, whether it might be the case that we need to shift some of the resources that train young people in reading competence to new kinds of technical competence that may or may not resemble exactly the kinds of thinking that literately deeply read people require. So I don't know the cognitive background to this, whether deep engineering think is the same kind of circuitry in the brain as deep literacy think. The question is simply whether a modernizing society needs to redistribute depth from different sectors of the kinds of depth you apply things to.
So I'm so glad you asked this question, because when I give 1 second to my biliterate brain, I didn't really even go into the beginning details of what that other parallel track is of the biliterate brain. And the other track is exactly what you're asking for. Now, I work with you. I hope you're not too surprised, but I work with electrical engineers. I work with Cynthia Brazil at MIT on what are, and Marina Bears, former colleague at Tufts, who you may know. All of these people are involved in using, especially pre-K, not just kindergarten on, but pre-K and kindergarten on. What are the skills that we must have for technical, what you would call deep competence? But it's really important for you to know that these skills that we are building here are complementary. Inference, induction, spatial skills. This is complementary. I'm suggesting that we develop them somewhat separately, but always bringing them together, especially by age 10. But having an understanding of, that goes back to Nicholas of Cusa, understand, have learned ignorance in the beginning, but learn what both are promoting cognitively, linguistically, motorically, spatially, visually. Our future depends. It is by no means coincidental that I'm working with engineers as we speak. It is no coincidence that I even said, though you probably didn't hear me, I am working so that the system can redress its own weaknesses. But I say that not just from a technical standpoint, but from a standpoint of if it's disrupting, what should we be doing so that these skills are not diminished? And how can we use this this other track to help? And just there's only one person on this screen who knows what I'm going to talk about, but Judy Cope knows that I have a reading intervention called Ravo, and none of you will ever, I can't, it's not self-promotional because none of you will ever have heard of it or will ever use it, but it's for children with dyslexia. And it's using both print, and in relationship, but also technology, looking at how we can use digital screeners to figure out the areas of weaknesses, how we can use some of digital to go after those weaknesses in an engaging way. So it is, when I say there's no binaries here, I am extremely serious. And the last thing I will say to you is that behind me is a painting by my dyslexic artist son. And over there, which you can't see, is something from Google where my other son works. So you can imagine the conversations over the last decade I have been having. But I can't agree with you more that we need deep technical competence. It must never be exclusive of what I'm talking about, nor does the deep reading brain exclude deep technical competence. If only we could all work together and make our educational system work like that. Thanks so
Wonderful
much.
answer. Wonderful answer.
Oh, by the way, half of my family are engineers. I'm the gray sheep.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I do digital media in an English department, but I was actually a lab school baby who was in pre-K and K. They did media effects research on me because that was my mom was a media effects researcher running a lab school. So in lollipops, right? But more importantly now, I have a 5-year-old, and so growing up in a house completely packed with books because both of the grandmothers are child librarians.
Oh, good.
But what I find myself wondering often while thinking about sort of the practical interface with mediation and comparative studies, and I hope this question's not too targeted, but I wonder about the difference between the materiality of the page and, like, say, the iPad surface or its interfaces and affordances on the one hand, and the sociality and affect of the book with the parent sitting on the couch and the iPad alone, right? In other words, should we be focused on interfaces and material affordances at all? Or should we be thinking more about the child who reads the iPad every night with their parent before going to bed and their sort of social and affective activation, right?
Oh, it's a great question. I know, and you can imagine there's 2 different dimensions to it that I'll want to say. I love the very fact that you talked about the affect, the social emotional aspect is so important. And my colleague Cynthia Brazil is actually doing work on, and I've helped her do this on certain books that are, if you will, iPad, but very interactive and that promote the dialogic reading that we want with print. But I will still argue that the very materiality of a book is really great for children who are in these sensory motor periods. It's great to be able to eat a book. You're not going to eat an iPad. And yet one of the great exploratory aspects of a child is to be able to put it in their mouth and not be, scolded or electrocuted. I mean, I'm being facetious here, because we need a little fun at the end of your day. A little humor is just good. But the reality is there is some research ongoing on your question about whether or not this helps, this dialogic reading with iPad. And it's observationally right now, it seems that it's good, but I don't think we've replaced the findings yet from John Hutton, what he calls the Goldilocks effect. I think we're still very much, and I will personally say, I feel very strongly that the materiality of a book for a young child is far better for multiple reasons, and some of which Catherine Hales has talked about, because I quoted her quite a few times in several of my books on this. So you should ask her that question too, though she probably isn't there.
Yes, thank you so much.
Maryanne, I just have to say ditto, 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 because, you know, an iPad or anytime a book is digital, out of sight, out of mind. A young child can't go over to the little book cubby or a shelf and have the agency and identity of which book do I want mommy, daddy to read to me now. It's the parents that are having to choose from the iPad. But again, we need more visual, physical evidence of books and language and words and everything, even in classrooms. We need more poetry charts on the walls, language, language, language.
I love what you said, Judy, about out of sight, out of mind. That's really true. I mean, they could pick up the iPad and finally find it, and they do. But the reality is, when you see it there, it's like Goodnight Moon. Oh, I don't know how many of you are parents, but who read Goodnight Moon 120 times. But part of the reason is that they wanted to hold it and to see it, and they wanted me to turn the page. There's the mouse. Oh, you skipped. There's it's a physicality, it's memory, it's also, and I really want to even ask the last speaker or last questioner, you know, have you ever felt the same when you have your child in your hand, in your arm under the crook with an iPad versus a book? I have a different experience with that, and I really think our children do too. So, but thank you, Judy. This is absolutely right.
You're my mentor, Maryanne. I just am agreeing with everything you say.
That means you're a party of one.
Okay with me. I like the party.
Emily
I like the
Dickinson said the soul selects its own society. So you're the only member of my select society. Everybody else rightly should argue, so should have their own thoughts. Thank you, Judy, though. Anybody else before you rightly have a glass of wine? I hope. Maybe I shouldn't say wine.
I thought I would mention, by the way, that I'm teaching now. Of course, I'm teaching my second year. Rebecca Baker here is co-teaching with me. And another student here, Nathaniel Navarez, was a student of it. It's called Data Stories.
Oh.
About how to tell good stories with data, as we see about COVID, for example, in newspapers all the time now.
Yeah.
And one of the paradigms that I use as a teaching example in this class is I bring in children's books.
Yes.
And I say there's a good analogy between a good children's story and a good data narrative.
Oh, what a beautiful thing. Judy Koch, who actually founded Bring Me a Book, is one of the leading experts on children's literature. So you should talk to her at some point. She's in Palo Alto. So you should, because she would give you examples you would love.
I'm very well read from 0 to 5. That's when I go to a cocktail party and they find that out. People tend to go on to the next person, but I would be happy to talk with you, Alan.
And I'll also mention that I'm currently teaching a multimedia criticism class where we spent a week on the history of the pop-up book since the Victorian period, and so we're focusing on the mediation of different forms and the way that the pop-ups and interactive media, especially as a children's literary form, but also in advertising, evolved in the late 1800s and into the current new renaissance of the pop-up book that we're in now. So I think it's a great way for people in media to take seriously paper and think about all of the incredible affordances it has, many of which were explored by people like Megendorfer thinking about things like doll houses and interactive experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. How wonderful. That sounds so fun. I'd love to take your course. Well, where's Inga? Inga, should we say goodbye?
I'm still here. Yeah. Again, I want to thank you a million for sticking it out with us and being here all day with us, and for this wonderful, perfect keynote. And yeah, I'm going to thank Anne Manger profusely for giving me like the power to almost force you into doing this.
Sure.
And I want to wish you all the luck with all your other keynotes and endeavors.
Thank you so much, and good luck to everybody. What a pleasure the day was. I learned so much. Goodbye to everybody.